These are the facts. Alger Hiss was chief architect of the United Nations. He was executive secretary at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference that laid the groundwork for the UN organization. Hiss was at Roosevelt's elbow at Yalta when most of Eastern Europe was given to the Russians. Hiss handled the planning in our State Department that ended with his pounding the gavel at the UN Founding Convention in San Francisco. As acting Secretary General, Hiss was able to staff UN agencies with his communist friends from around the world. Through these red agents, he was able to influence the hiring of hundreds of UN employees, many of whom were traitors to America. Most of them still remain in office. These employees sign an oath upon assuming their duties. They then owe their loyalty not to their own nation, but to the United Nations. In their capacity as UN citizens, these people cannot be held accountable for treason against the United States. The so-called United Nations Treaty is not a regular treaty within the general meaning of that term. Rather, the UN Charter is a constitution for one world government. Its sole aim is to do away with the United States Constitution and put in its place the Charter of the UN as supreme law of the land. Apologists for the UN attempt to minimize the influence of Alger Hiss in the selection of employees for this organization. The record is clear. Alger Hiss was influential in the hiring of exactly 494 persons by the United Nations on its initial staff. Some of the American communists who played key roles in the UN were Harry Dexter White, identified as a communist agent, Virginius Cole, now working for the Red Chinese government, Lawrence Duggan, identified as a member of a Soviet spy ring, Noel Field, identified communist, who later disappeared behind the Iron Curtain, Henry Wadley, self-confessed American spy for Russia, John Carter Vincent, chief of the Chinese Affairs Division of our State Department and an identified communist, David Weintraub, identified as a top underground agent for the communists, Nathan Silvermaster, head of a communist spy cell, Harold Glasser, a communist agent, Victor Perlow, head of a communist cell and reporter for The Worker, Lachlan Curry, longtime fellow traveler, and Irving Kaplan, who took the Fifth Amendment 244 times before Senate investigating committees. These men in positions of authority in our government helped to lay the groundwork for the United Nations. They used their positions to generate a communist-inspired United States foreign policy. The United Nations Charter was designed as an instrument of communist force. In a review of the UN Charter, a committee of the United States Senate stated, "The Charter of the UN has become supreme law of the land. The judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution to the contrary notwithstanding." For years, one of the top American policymakers in the United States has been Ralph Bunche. His record speaks for itself. Bunche was a member of the communist magazine Science and Society for over 4 years. In 1936, he authored a pamphlet entitled A World View of Race. The October 1937 issue of The Communist liked this pamphlet so well it stated, "A fresh breeze is blowing, carrying with it elements of Marxist thought." In his pamphlet, Bunche said, "Class will one day supplant race in world affairs. Race war will then be merely a sideshow to the gigantic class war which will be waged in the big tent we call the world." In 1943, Bunche served in the State Department under Alger Hiss. He was a leader with Hiss in the notorious Institute of Pacific Relations, branded by the Senate Committee as an instrument of communist policy, propaganda, and military intelligence. When Hiss was exposed as a communist, Ralph Bunche wrote him a letter stating, I want you to know I am in your corner. Bunch has served in a top capacity with the United Nations ever since. In 1928, the Communist International set forth their three-stage plan to rule the world. The plan was, 1. Socialize the economies of all nations. 2. Bring about regional groupings of these socialized nations. 3. Join all these groupings into a final worldwide union of socialist states. This is being accomplished today through the United Nations. The UN was conceived in criminal conspiracy and dedicated to the idea that all men on earth should be leveled to the equal status of slaves in a one-world red dictatorship. Within the United Nations, there are various subdivisions. One such division is UNESCO. In 1955, Congressman Lawrence Smith described UNESCO as a permanent international snake pit where godless communism is given a daily forum for hate, recrimination, psychological warfare against freedom, and unrelenting moral aggression against peace. The purpose of UNESCO is to achieve control of our educational system, to ridicule and destroy any feelings of patriotism in our youth, to instill in American youth feelings of internationalism, to bring them into a concept of a one-world communist empire, to teach our youth to embrace Marxian socialism, to neutralize American youth against the religious influences of the home and all other concepts of morality which would interfere with their accepting communism. Ex-communist Joseph Cornfetter has said, UNESCO corresponds to the agitation and propaganda department of the Communist Party. It handles the strategy of getting at the public mind, young and old. UNESCO publishes much literature for young people. All of it is slanted away from the spiritual and political beliefs of the United States. It is slanted toward the sterile concepts of a one-world government to be built upon atheistic foundations. A second division of the United Nations is the position of Assistant Secretary General for Security Affairs. This position has always been held by a communist. It is, in effect, the commander of UN forces. In that regard, American soldiers are now trained to control American citizens, and recruiting posters for the armed services frequently show only the UN flag. In the 20 years since its inception, the United Nations has not freed a single enslaved person. It has not prevented the enslavement of a single person, nor has it tried to. The United Nations is not in the business of preserving liberty. In Red China, as the communists enslaved that nation, between 14 and 20 million men, women, and children were murdered. The UN paid no heed. In North Korea, thousands of resistors were put out to die in freezing weather. The UN-controlled American forces were not permitted to liberate the country. 5,000 American boys were murdered and dumped into nameless graves. The UN refused to condemn this act. Russian tanks crushed Hungary. The UN took no action. Russia built the Berlin Wall. The UN looked the other way. The Red Chinese looted Tibet and virtually wiped out the entire population. The UN did nothing. In the Congo, UN troops slaughtered innocent men, women, and children, and bombed hospitals while the United Nations tried to install a communist puppet in power. In 1948, the United Nations put forth its Declaration of Human Rights. It proclaimed that every person has the right to Social Security, a job, protection against unemployment, to equal pay for equal work, and the right to an education. But we must remember that none of the so-called rights are automatic or natural. Each of these rights requires someone produce something. It involves the use of somebody's life. The UN, in claiming these things as rights, takes the stand that those who produce owe their lives to those who do not. People who support the Trojan horse on the East River generally give the following reasons. 1. It is our last best hope for peace. Most Americans believe peace involves freedom. The UN version of peace is the kind that reigns in a slave labor camp. The UN cannot maintain peace so long as it has entrenched within it the most aggressive, peace-destroying movement on earth. What the communists really think about the United Nations can best be seen in their own publications intended for party members. In these publications, the UN receives glowing praise. Alger Hiss, traitorous felon, helped to bring into being the United Nations. Ratification of the UN treaty by our Congress constituted total surrender to foreign governments of the rights and liberties of the American people. These are the facts.